Good afternoon, everybody. It's Jonathan Keller from California Family Council. Happy to be back with you here on Facebook Live, YouTube, and any of these other channels that you're watching things on. We had a couple technical difficulties, so if you were on our previous broadcast, I apologize, but we think we've fixed those now. I think you can hopefully all hear us and see us. I wanted to jump right in and tell you that today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Michael New. He is the visiting assistant professor at the Catholic University of America and an associate scholar with the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Dr. New, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So, Dr. New, we wanted to have you on today because earlier this week, just a couple days ago, the Supreme Court handed down a 5-4 decision, June Medical v. Russo. And this is a case that dealt with admitting privileges and medical regulations, standards, health standards at abortion clinics. It was very similar to a case out of Texas from 2016. And if you'd like a deep dive on that case, we actually did talk about that. I discussed that a couple days ago on Facebook with my colleague, John Girardi from Right to Life Central California. But Dr. New, a lot of pro-lifers today are feeling very kind of discouraged. They're upset at a betrayal, frankly, from Justice John Roberts. The thing that really blew my mind in looking at this case over the last several days was I was actually shocked to find something that Justice Roberts said in his confirmation hearing, and I just want to read it to you really quick. He actually says, on the subject of stare decisis, referring to Brown versus Board, the decision overturning the school segregation, this is in his confirmation hearing, he said, quote, the court in that case, of course, overruled a prior decision. I don't think that constitutes judicial activism because obviously if the decision is wrong, it should be overruled. That's not activism, that's applying the law correctly. So remarkably, to see Justice Roberts in his role as the chief admit in his decision, he said in his opinion in this case that I still believe that June Medical was wrongly decided, but I also think that, stare decisis, blah, 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 we really kind of have to let the decision stand from last time, and we can't so quickly cancel the precedent, even though it's only 4 years old, even though it was really extenuating circumstances. Obviously very disappointing and frustrating to see that happen. But you wrote a great article in Time Magazine. No, excuse me, Town Hall, not Time Magazine.
Which was Time Magazine, but
Hey, I think one of these.
But Town Hall is great. Town Hall is a good publication, good reach. Glad they published my article.
Yeah. Well, I really hope. I know there's those groups are always looking for good conservative commentary. And the thing I thought was so great about your article and about the pitch that you said was essentially you're trying to just remind pro-lifers. We've seen a lot of frustration. I said I've seen conservatives switch between anger and frustration and despair. I mean, there's really been a lot of concern over how do we move forward from this decision when we've had the conservative legal project over 30 plus years, really trying to fight back and establish good judges, pick good justices with the Federalist Society and everybody else. A lot of people are either throwing up their hands or they're just giving up. And I'm putting up a photo of your article here, Dr. New. You actually said, despite the ruling in June Medical Services v. Russo, pro-lifers should not give up or give in. So tell us, Dr. New, I've got that up here, and we'll go ahead and put that link in the description here. But tell us why is it that you say that? Why should pro-lifers not give up or give in?
Well, just broadly speaking, no one ever promised us a smooth trajectory to victory. Down the road, we're going to lose court cases. We're going to lose elections. Progress doesn't always come smoothly. But I think it's important to kind of take a long-term view of this. That yes, the decision's disappointment is a setback, but we shouldn't despair, and that's for several reasons. First, when you look at kind of the history of jurisprudence, very often pro-lifers have benefited from being persistent. I can think of several cases where we've had to appeal decisions or pass revised laws, and it's only through that appeals process or the process of revising laws that we've gotten these laws upheld. The Supreme Court, on more than one occasion during the 1970s, struck down pro-life parental involvement laws. And then in the 80s and 90s, they started to uphold these laws. The Supreme Court struck down the federal partial birth abortion ban in 2000 before they upheld it in 2007. So, I mean, given Roberts' opinion in this case, I'm not super optimistic that he'd be inclined to uphold future clinic regulations. But it's possible that the two judges on the Supreme Court who are the oldest are Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Breyer. They're both Democrat appointees who both voted to strike down the law. If President Trump wins re-election, there is a possibility he might be able to appoint the replacements. Something we need to think about. Secondly, we see a lot of states that are very active passing pro-life laws. Guttmacher tracks this data very carefully. They've said we've passed over 400 state-level pro-life laws since 2010. And many of them are going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. And just because we didn't get a good decision on this law, that doesn't mean that future laws might be upheld. I think the next big abortion case the Supreme Court will likely hear will involve the constitutionality of 20-week abortion bans. Here I think this puts us on good ground for a variety of reasons. First off, most people don't like late-term abortion, and just getting the issue out there does shift the debate to terrain where pro-lifers tend to do well. Secondly, we do have evidence, good medical evidence, that unborn children can feel pain at 20 weeks of gestation. That might create a compelling state interest to protect the preborn. Third, the Supreme Court's never really ruled on 20-week abortion bans. As such, Roberts can't really fall back on a stare decisis rationale if he wants to strike down these bans. He might find arguments in their favor to be persuasive. So, again, there's lots of state-level laws being passed. They will be appeal to the Supreme Court. We will get other chances to defend different kinds of laws. We might get a different outcome. And just lastly, we've made good progress on a lot of different fronts. We see abortion clinics closing. We see pregnancy help centers opening. And the one statistic I give over and over again to any pro-life audience that will listen to me is we have gotten the abortion rate down by 50% since 1980. That means at any given year, a woman of childbearing age is half as likely as her counterpart was 40 years ago to have had an abortion that year. And we haven't succeeded in changing public policy that much in 40 years. Sadly, abortion is legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy in all 50 states. The big thing that's happened is we've seen a higher percentage of unintended pregnancies being carried to term. So it's not that unintended pregnancies aren't happening, it's when they do happen, women are choosing life. So that means our educational efforts, our service efforts, and our legislative efforts are all bearing fruit, and we just need to keep it up. I wish we could do more faster, but we have made progress. And I'm confident if we stay the course, victory, I think, will someday be ours.
Well, that's a really encouraging reminder. The thing that I think, as you said, it's not a time for despair. I think that so often as pro-lifers, I think we can see the steady march forward of groups like Planned Parenthood and NARAL and all these other groups that have continued to try to expand. But as you said, there's been a huge number of laws that have been passed in the last, even just the last 10 years. And I think it's a reminder that a lot of times we can forget. We think that during the Obama administration, for example, a lot of pro-lifers were justly concerned that you had a very pro-abortion president. You had a strongly pro-abortion legislature for those first 2 years. And yet, after those first 2 years, you had the 2010 midterms. And during that time, and then in the ensuing several years afterwards, you had hundreds of pro-life legislators swept into office across the country. And many of them were able to pass substantive pro-life laws. And you mentioned there are just a couple of the ones that may not be able to be struck down quite as easily. They may not be quite as directly applicable to the Hellerstedt case. Dr. New, I want to ask you, there's some person that I saw that I thought this was maybe a little bit of an aggressive bit of optimism, but it was Hugh Hewitt, who is a professor of law at Chapman University Law School. He has also been a radio host, worked in the Reagan Justice Department, actually alongside Justice Roberts. And Hugh Hewitt essentially had said something a few days ago in response to the June Medical case. He was, I think, disappointed, but he was likewise not despairing. He was trying to, encourage pro-lifers not to give up immediately. He still thought that I think it was wrongly decided, and he wished that Justice Roberts would do the same thing. But he also said that, look, there's a chance here that Justice Roberts is, as you said, very directly applying stare decisis. But if something changes and there is a there's a case that comes before the court that more directly asks the court to reconsider Casey v.
Mhm.
Planned Parenthood and even Roe v. Wade. If there is a case that is allowing us to look at the original text, um, it's possible that you might actually see a more sweeping pro-life law. And
Mhm.
I'd actually like to get your opinion on this. I know I was trying to remember. You're not an attorney, also, are you?
No, I have a PhD in political science, but I'm not an attorney.
I'm the same way. So we had our
Mhm.
attorney on yesterday. So I actually appreciate the political science angle of it today.
Mhm.
Um, Something that was an interesting angle that I actually thought kind of tied together a potential avenue that actually is maybe a silver lining found in Justice Gorsuch's opinion in the Bostock case from a few weeks ago. A lot of conservatives were very, I think, frustrated and alarmed that he found in that case. Apparently, over the last 50 years, the right to non-discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity apparently was hiding in plain sight in Title VII all
Mhm.
along. A lot of people were concerned and said, well, how is this? How is it possible that this has been just? I was trying to remember the exact Supreme Court phrase that one of my friends told me. I guess it's elephants hiding in cupboards or something like that. Um, Something that is so blatantly obvious that it's amazing that there would be that there would be someone that, or there would be a principle that would be used like that. So I guess my question is it possible that that type of a surprise precedent, using Justice Gorsuch's past decision here, could we almost see a potential positive like that? Maybe you need to have one more solid Supreme Court justice on
Mhm.
that is in favor of the pro-life position. Maybe it won't happen with the current makeup of the court. But just like Justice Gorsuch was able to read in the idea of, well, sexual identity and or sexual orientation and gender identity is tied up in the word sex in Title VII. Is it possible that you could have Justice Gorsuch or another person writing for the court that might be willing to find a right to life for the unborn hidden, quote unquote? We would argue it's right there in plain sight, but hidden in the text of maybe the 14th Amendment, for example.
I mean, I think that anything is possible. I mean, one thing I read, Robert's opinion, and he doesn't really engage, the precedent in Roe or Casey all that much. He just said this is a case that's not really designed to challenge Roe v. Wade or Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and just kind of jumps on to Hellerstedt and just talks about stare decisis. So it is possible that he could be persuaded that Casey was wrongly decided. Personally, I would feel more comfortable with another judge on the Supreme Court. I don't think Roberts likes 5-4 decisions where all the Republican appointed judges vote one way and all the Democrat appointed judges vote another. I think he'd be a lot more comfortable joining a opinion where there's more of a consensus among Supreme Court justices. So again, I not as optimistic as Hugh Hewitt, perhaps, but I do think that pro-lifers should move forward and appeal cases and do so, aggressively but smartly as well. And again, I don't think we need to despair. I mean, I think that there are different cases out there that and different arguments we can make that might attract 5 votes. And again, as I said before, well, obviously I've heard some rumors about a presidential election this upcoming year. That if President Trump wins, he may get to appoint a couple more Supreme Court justices. The 2 oldest judges are both Democrat appointees, Justice Breyer and Justice Ginsburg. Again, I think that could create a much more durable majority that might uphold some of these pro-life laws.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. The interesting thing there is that I've heard some of those same types of things with Justice Roberts. Is that he's very reluctant and very reticent to have the court be drawn into a lot of these major political fights, especially along the lines of a 5-4 decision.
Mm-hmm.
He cares deeply about the legitimacy of the court. And my friend John Girardi, again, the attorney from Right to Life Central California, the executive director over there, he actually had an interesting take on Justice Roberts' decision in the June medical case, and also in the fact maybe that he voted with the majority, even though Justice Gorsuch wrote the opinion in the Bostock case, that he voted with the majority in that case. And then getting outside some of the issues that California Family Council normally covers, Justice Roberts also voted to strike down the Trump administration's attempts to end the DACA program.
Mhm.
So the interesting thing, and Dr. New, I'm very curious of your thoughts on this, but John Girardi said, I wonder if this is almost like what you saw happen with the court during the 1930s, when
Mhm.
after the Supreme Court had initially struck down many of President Roosevelt's, FDR's
Mhm.
programs, the New Deal and other things,
Mhm.
President Roosevelt was talking about
Mhm.
trying to pack the court and add
Mhm.
multiple justices explicitly for the purpose of trying to overwhelm the existing majority that was
Mhm.
opposed to his policies.
Mhm.
Um, the interesting thing that I heard some people say was at that time the justices actually switched their positions and allowed
Mhm.
some of his things to become enacted, even
Mhm.
though the laws didn't change. But they looked at the calculus and they said, it maybe is better institutionally when we have a president that is threatening to essentially, frankly, blow up the current status quo of the judiciary. Maybe it's better to try to limit the damage, or at least limit the radical revolution restructuring that could happen,
Mhm.
um, and to go along with this. And it was something that was called at the time the switch in time that saved nine.
Mhm.
The nine being the nine justices. So
Mhm.
it's interesting. With already you had in the Democratic primary debates, you had several candidates, whether it was Pete Buttigieg or I think Elizabeth
Mhm.
Warren. I mean, multiple Democrats were talking about possibly trying to pack the court. Um, is that something that you think maybe? I mean, we like to think that the court isn't political, but do you think that might be part of the reason why Justice Roberts not only ruled the way he did in June Medical, but also in some of these other cases?
I think that that's certainly possible. I mean, you raise a good analogy there that, well, a lot of people do forget that the Supreme Court was a real thorn in the side of President Roosevelt, especially during his first term. And, even had judges who kind of thought maybe some of the programs that were proposed were not bad ideas on their merits, but they just ran afoul of the Constitution. And frankly, the powers of the federal government were thought to be a lot more limited in the early 1930s than people do today. And they struck down a lot of these programs. Roosevelt did suggest packing the court. One thing that was important to remember is he did win a landslide re-election, and I think that again, we don't know exactly what was going through people's minds, but I think that probably did have an impact. That the Supreme Court does value legitimacy, and if time after time they're issuing opinions that are very unpopular, that nobody likes, that affect a lot of people, they're going to lose the legitimacy. So I think they did make a political calculus back in the mid 1930s to uphold some of Roosevelt's subsequent programs. Is Roberts, concerned about a future Democratic president packing the court? That's hard to say. A lot of times people running for president say things to fire up their kind of primary voters who tend to be a lot more ideological. I do think if a President Biden or another Democrat try to get additional judges on the Supreme Court, it would prompt a very strong backlash. You would see a filibuster. I would expect Republicans to oppose such efforts very vigorously. But again, I do think that Roberts is trying to kind of politicize the court in certain ways. I think he wants the court to be quote unquote less partisan. I do think he wants to be quote unquote less predictable. I do think that motivated certainly his decision in the Obamacare case a few years ago, and I do think it motivated his decision in some respects this week in June Medical Services v. Russo.
Yeah, again, we hope that that's not the case, but that the justices are people too, and
Yep.
they are going to definitely at least see what is happening, and
Mm-hmm.
they're not so divorced from politics that they're unaware of how their decisions are going to affect things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was very famously, I was trying to remember which year it was, if it was 2011 or 2012, when in his State of the Union address, President Obama explicitly called
Mm-hmm.
out the Supreme Court and denounced their decision in the Citizens United case.
Yep, I
And
remember that.
it was a very famous kind of tense scene because you had
Mm-hmm.
Democrats standing and applauding. And I remember Justice Samuel Alito sitting there in the State of the Union and shaking his head and mouthing "not true." Now
Mhm.
he didn't stand up and shout or be disruptive, but
Mhm.
there's always been, I think, this kind of tension and this balance between the three branches. Of course, the
Mhm.
legislature and the executive, and the judiciary. And it is interesting to see how they're going to balance that moving forward. I do think that Justice Roberts, I mean, has to at least look at, as you said, without knowing the results of the November election, we do know that barring an incredible, monumental shakeup, Joe Biden is going to be the nominee of the
Mhm.
Democrats. And he was not one of those people that was primarily calling out the court
Mhm.
during the campaign. He was not primarily saying that we needed to pack the court. And in the past, he has not even been broadly supportive of eliminating the filibuster. I mean, we can at least be grateful for the fact that he has not been as radical with trying to alter the structural makeup of the court and the judiciary as someone like Elizabeth Warren or even Pete Buttigieg. Um, but that being said, a statistic that I saw a couple days ago that really blew my mind was Justice Roberts. It's very rare for the Chief Justice and the swing vote to be the same person.
Mhm.
Um, and for us to see that here, for it to be a case where now with Anthony Kennedy retiring, the statistic I saw the other day was that Justice Roberts has been in the majority during this Supreme Court case, the
Mhm.
Supreme Court term, 98% of the time.
Um,
I mean, it's extremely rare that
mhm.
he is going to be um, in the minority, and I do wonder, as you said, how that will affect things kind of going forward. Any thoughts on just as we move forward, what the court might look like, best case scenario under a Biden administration?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think that it's interesting that Roberts votes with the majority 98% of the time, and I think that's kind of by design. I mean, as a Chief Justice, he does get to decide who writes the majority opinion, and I think that if he does vote with the majority, again, let me rephrase it, if he votes with the majority, he gets to decide who writes the majority opinion, and I think that does sometimes guide him that he wants to decide who's going to write that opinion. Whereas if he votes with the minority, it's the ranking judge who decides who's going to, or the ranking judge who voted with the majority gets to decide who writes the majority opinion. So I think that some of the reasons why he often votes the majority may, again, to some level, be political. What will the Supreme Court look like under a Biden administration? Again, as I said before, the two oldest Supreme Court judges are Stephen Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, both Clinton appointees. I think that there's a good chance that both would retire during Biden's first term. Again, we don't know that for certain. I don't expect any real surprises out of a Biden appointee. That liberals have a pretty deep bench of people that they'd like to nominate for the Supreme Court. I do think you would definitely get somebody who would obviously uphold Roe v. Wade and strike down whatever pro-life laws are brought to the Supreme Court. One cautionary note I always tell people is that pro-lifers have kind of been on offense for most of the last couple decades, but it's possible that we do have some favorable precedents a Supreme Court could conceivably strike down. We've gotten, for instance, parental involvement laws and informed consent laws and waiting periods upheld. I think the kind of judges that Joe Biden might nominate might strike down those laws.
Hmm.
We worked very hard in the 70s and going into 1980 on a case called Harris v. McRae, upheld the Hyde Amendment. We won that by a single vote. The Supreme Court did say abortion, yes, is legal, but the federal government isn't required to pay for it with taxpayer dollars. So, I mean, that upheld the Constitution, the Hyde Amendment. That saves tens of thousands of lives every year. My own research shows it saved over 2 million lives since 1976. I could see a Biden Supreme Court nominee saying that case was long decided and effectively forcing the federal government to fund elective abortions through the Medicaid program. So I think that there's a real cautionary note here that we may have to consider playing defense again. I think that the likely retirees would be those judges who were appointed by President Clinton. So it wouldn't really change the ideological composition of the court that much. But we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. Judges do get ill. Judges do pass away. Unexpected things do happen. And I just think that we certainly need to be prepared.
Well, and on that note, I don't know if you've seen the breaking news today, but there was actually a story from Robert Costa, who's a political reporter in the Washington Post, and Hugh Hewitt actually spoke with him on his radio show as well. So I've seen tweets flying around. I'm surprised that it actually has not broken through on Twitter. I think just because it is reporting and it is not an actual announcement. But there were multiple stories floating around today. Initially, it was that Justice Thomas was considering retiring. Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, just turned 72 a few weeks ago, and he wrote, arguably, I've not had a chance to read the entire opinion, but the excerpts I've read, his dissent in the June medical case was just masterful. And the fact that
I agree.
He essentially didn't just say that, well, I think this law is unconstitutional, but Dr. New, you could correct me or expound on this, but he essentially said that the entire edifice of abortion law is built on a fiction, and that Roe itself must be reversed.
No, you're absolutely correct. He wrote a very, very powerful dissent saying the Supreme Court just shouldn't be in this business of trying to regulate abortion to begin with, that there's nothing about abortion in the text of the Constitution, and this is just simply a matter to be handled by states and state legislators. They're the ones who should be making abortion policy, not the Supreme Court. It was very powerful, very well written, and I would recommend it to anybody.
Well, and so there's a chance, based on the reporting we've seen today, Justice Thomas is considering retiring. And unfortunately, if you look at the current poll numbers, President Trump has not been looking good the last several weeks. Joe Biden is above 50% in a string of polls. And it's entirely possible that Justice Thomas may be looking and saying, I'm 72. I've already been on the court. He's currently the longest tenured member on the court. He has been there since 1991 or 1992. I can't remember when he actually started. I believe it was 91. But the idea that he has now been there for almost 30 years, I think his concern is just with his own health and wanting to possibly spend time with his family and his wife. If President Trump loses, it could be a minimum of 4 more years, maybe 8 more years until there is another pro-life president elected. And I think it's totally justifiable after his tenure that he may want to consider moving on. And also just actuarial tables. The fact that Justice Scalia died, I believe, at age 79. Justice Thomas is, I think, similarly, I'll put it politely, not necessarily in the best physical shape. There's a lot of late night shows and articles that have been written about Justice Ginsburg's fitness routine, and the fact that even in her mid 80s now, at age 84, she is extremely active and tries to be as healthy as she can. Justice Thomas, I know we've seen he likes to fish and other things like that, but he's not necessarily known for going out and running marathons or anything like that. We'll just put it that way. So I think it'd be totally understandable that he would want to potentially retire. But the other thing that I think took people by surprise, not only Justice Thomas, but Hugh Hewitt responded and said, I have heard from my sources that Justice Alito, even though he has been there much less time, he's only been there since 2005. He was appointed by President Bush. But even so, Justice Alito is, I think, getting tired of Washington, and he and his family are ready to leave and maybe get back to real life. So obviously, those are two of the strongest justices. Arguably, if you look at the ideological maps that we see sometimes, Justice Thomas is considered usually the most conservative, followed closely by Justice Alito, and then maybe Justice Gorsuch after that. But let me ask you on that note, obviously, if either of those two justices retired or passed away during a Biden administration or another strongly pro-abortion administration, that would be a disaster for the cause of life. Given the floating idea of those retirements, I don't know if you've heard anything about that since you yourself are actually back there in D.C., but given those rumors, how credible do you think those might be? And number two, do you think there are any leading candidates that you have heard of that you think would be a solid replacement for either of those two justices that would be their equal either intellectually or ideologically?
I mean, it seems every year I always hear rumors about Supreme Court retirements. I'm not saying these rumors are wrong, but I'm just saying rumors tend to fly around a lot about potential retirements. Obviously, the Supreme Court holds a lot of power over a lot of issues that a lot of us care strongly about, and a lot of people like to speculate. And again, I have no inside knowledge. I'm not here to say these rumors are correct or they're wrong, but just rumors are just kind of pretty common. As far as good replacements, I think the top person on every conservative's list would be Amy Coney Barrett, who is a law professor at Notre Dame. That a lot of people were hoping that President Trump would have nominated her. I think she would have been preferred by many conservatives to Brett Kavanaugh. She's someone who's very well respected in conservative legal circles. Again, she's a professor at Notre Dame. And I also just think the optics of having a Republican appoint a woman, and frankly, we don't know how she would rule, but it's likely she would be very sympathetic to pro-life laws. Having a woman choose to uphold a lot of these state level pro-life laws, the optics would just look good instead of having all men. Or a voting block of all men choose to uphold a pro-life law. I think, again, Amy Coney Barrett would be number one on just about everybody's list. Again, I think that she would be a very, very wise choice to replace either Justice Thomas or Justice Alito.
Well, that's good to hear. And I know, again, I mentioned before our my colleague, a good friend, John Girardi, he actually went to Notre Dame Law School and he got to study with Amy Coney Barrett, and he has nothing but utmost praise for her. He thinks she's just fantastic. I would love to obviously see someone like that. It was interesting. I did see some people say yesterday that one of the just kind of puzzling things about the June Medical case was that there were a lot of opinions that were written in that case. There was a case written by an opinion written, of course, by Justice Roberts, the opinion was written by one was written by Justice Roberts, another opinion was written by Justice Breyer. Then you had one opinion written by Justice Thomas. You had one you had Gorsuch and everybody else, Alito. The fascinating thing was the only person who did not write an opinion about those cases were the three women on the court. Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ginsburg. And it's interesting. I will say, as a pro-lifer, as a conservative, it is a little bit frustrating and discouraging from time to time, because Michael, you and I know, Dr. New, I should say, you and I know multiple amazing pro-life women. I think of many of the leaders of the pro-life movement that we have had the privilege to work alongside. Not all of them are attorneys, but many of them are. I mean, people like Catherine Glenn Foster from Americans United for Life, Jeannie Mancini from the March for Life, Penny Nance from Concerned Women for America, Kathy Roos from the Family Research Council, Irina Grosu, now at the Health and Human Services Department. I mean, the pro-life movement is not short of phenomenally talented, brilliant pro-life women in leadership roles. And it really is, to be frank, I'm grateful for the last four Republican appointees to the court. I'm grateful for Justice Roberts. This decision notwithstanding, I think he has had some good decisions, but the decisions of the last four appointees from Republicans, Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, they're all fine, all well and good. But if you look at three of the last four appointees from the Democrats, you have Justice Ginsburg, you have Justice Sotomayor, and you have Justice Kagan. I really do wish that the pro-life movement and our pro-life presidents, President Bush and President Trump, would be a little bit more strategic and pick one of these phenomenally qualified, phenomenally conservative pro-life women to be the next appointee to the court, because I do think that's so necessary. Because we know, as we talked about at the beginning, Justice Roberts is not only looking at the court as a legal angle, but he's looking at it as our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom say, we need to win the battle both in the court of law and the court of public opinion. And I think that having an actual female jurist on the nation's highest court who's a pro-lifer would be a huge benefit in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, that's been just sort of a missed opportunity. I mean, people like, Marianne Glenn at Harvard Law School, I mean, because I think of her age, she really may not be an ideal pick currently, but she's certainly someone who could have been an excellent selection. There are others as well. And I agree. I think that optics do mean something, and sometimes we're sadly sometimes not always savvy about that. I remember when I think President Bush signed the bill that banned partial birth abortion. The signing ceremony, I'm sure it was an accident, but the signing ceremony was just all men. And it just didn't look good. I mean, I just wish some PR person could have whispered in his ear.
Yeah.
This is just not the image you want to necessarily convey. And again, I'm sure it wasn't done out of spite or malice, but it was a blind spot. And I think that, again, having a Republican nominate a woman to the Supreme Court, especially with cases involving abortion likely being heard, that would just make a lot of sense.
Well, Dr. New, you've been incredibly gracious with your time. I know I originally said we would go 15 to 20 minutes. We've gone 35, so I apologize for keeping you so long.
No, don't apologize. It's an honor. Happy to do this for you.
I'd love to have you back on again sometime. Where can people find you? I know I'm right now just real quick putting up your Twitter feed, and people can see right here you are Michael_J_new at NRO.com. Or at, excuse me. I'm sorry.
Hold on. My Twitter handle is at Michael_J_new.
I'm sorry. I messed that up because I put the overlay of your most recent tweet, and I saw that you'd written for National Review, so I accidentally included that in there. But yes, folks, if you look here, just right here, his Twitter handle, I'm going to highlight it so it's the easiest to see. Very, very simple. Right there up at the top. People should be able to see that, and you can find him on Twitter. Tell us real quick about this article. I know there's another one that you wrote just today. Gallup poll finds relative stability on public opinion on abortion.
Yeah, sure. I've do cover the social science of abortion for the pro-life movement, and one thing I read about is public opinion trends. And we've actually seen two polls come out recently that show public opinion during the pandemic has been relatively stable when it comes to sanctity of life issues. NBC News did a poll, and now Gallup about every year does a poll on abortion attitudes, and it's pretty stable. This poll found that 46% identify as pro-life, 48% identify as pro-choice. I think what's a little more hopeful is when they kind of break down circumstances where abortion should be legal. That essentially when they ask abortion to be legal in all circumstances, most circumstances, few circumstances, or no circumstances, we get actually a majority who want it legal in only few or no circumstances. This poll showed that 55% of Americans think abortion should be legal in either only a few circumstances or no circumstances. So, basically that's a good finding. Another good finding is that we're doing better than I think we realize. That back as recently as 1995, only 33% of Americans identified as pro-life. Now we're at 46%. That's a 13 percentage point gain. And if you look at a lot of demographic shifts in this country, you wouldn't necessarily expect that. The one thing we've noticed, having researched public attitudes on abortion, is that wealthy people tend to support legal abortion. People are better educated, in terms of formal education, I should say. Have people having advanced degrees, they tend to support legal abortion. If you have kind of fairly liberal / progressive views on social issues, if you think premarital sex is morally acceptable, you're likely to support legal abortion. So over time, people are becoming better educated, they're becoming wealthier, and we see from a lot of surveys that they're adopting more quote-unquote liberal or permissive views on social issues. So you see these kind of quote-unquote trends that should not portend well for the pro-life movement. But even though these other trends are going in the wrong direction for us, we're actually making gains in the core public opinion. So that's a good thing. So we're kind of facing some strong cultural headwinds, but doing pretty well in terms of persuading people about the merits of the pro-life position. And one thing I point out in my blog post today is that that's a positive development. We're very tenacious, and our educational efforts are bearing fruit.
Well, that's so encouraging to hear that there is it's just a reminder for all of us, as you said, going back to that title of your original article, despite ruling in June medical, pro-lifers should not give up or give in. There's so many avenues in which the pro-life movement is making positive strides. And on the flashback side of things, I remember looking at my Facebook feed and seeing flashbacks from a few years ago in 2018. Every year on Facebook, you get something that says, remember on this day, this is a post that you did. And I remember seeing that post from 2 years ago where pro-lifers were rejoicing. We were absolutely jubilant because the Supreme Court had ruled only by a 5-4 decision, but they had ruled in favor of the pregnancy care centers right here in our own state of California, the Nifla v.
Yep.
Becerra decision. And
Mm-hmm.
that, I mean, as painful and bitter as it was to see the June medical decision go the wrong way, man, what a blessing, what a relief
Yep.
to see
Mm-hmm.
pregnancy care centers in the state of California not subjected to the brutalities of having to advertise for abortions in their
Mm-hmm.
own websites, their clinics, and everything else. So,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, we need to make sure that we don't get myopic and we don't have, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a distorted vision of how things are going.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that was a very important win, and I think when the other side really goes after pregnancy help centers, it really shows how radical they are. I think your average quote unquote pro-choice person does not have a problem with pregnancy help centers. They think if there's private organizations that want to help pregnant women in need, that's a good thing. It's only the real radicals, the real people on the hard left that really think this is a bad idea, that really want to hinder their efforts. I think that, promoting the good work that they do is very important for us. And again, that was a very nice when we had the Supreme Court. And I think we should be grateful for the times that we do get good outcomes, because that does show that our political efforts, do bear fruit. We don't always get what we want, but our batting average isn't zero. Far from it. We have notched some impressive victories.
Yeah, and that's a very important way to put it. Is if you strike out every now and then, I mean, you got to think that even some of the most I'm not a huge baseball fan, so I apologize. All my friends who are much better at the stats are going to kill me, but I do know enough at least to say that the batting average of some of the best Hall of Famers is still only in the 300s.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that a lot of times people will strike out or fly out more than they will get on base. In that sense, we need to at least remember that it's not whether we're swinging for the fences every time or trying for just a base hit. We're not always going to get it, and we need to be grateful for the things that we've won and remember those when we face frustrations like the last decision here on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. New, again, I just want to thank you so much. People can find you on Twitter at Michael_J_New.
Correct.
And of course, obviously, they can find your columns at National Review, at Town Hall, and any other places they should look for you before we go.
People can just friend me on Facebook. If they're friends with you, they can find me. I'll accept a friend request if you have some friends in common. I usually post my kind of op-eds and blog posts there. But Twitter is probably the best way to follow what I do. Every time I do write something, I do circulate it on Twitter, and that's a good way to keep up with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been a blessing and a pleasure to have you with us today. Folks, I appreciate you being with us. I know this was a little bit of a long episode, but I'm grateful so much for Dr. New joining us and for the ability to give you kind of a deep dive, not just into kind of the surface issues of the pro-life movement, but actually some of the nuts and bolts of these studies. And I cannot encourage you enough. Go check out Dr. New's work. Dr. New, obviously, I know you write a lot of very scholarly papers, for peer review, but one of the things I appreciate so much about your articles is that it condenses, or I should say distills, that very heady, scholarly work down to something that, the layman like myself can read and really grasp and comprehend. So thank you for that.
I'm glad to do it. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Folks, we will be back with more about these cases. We didn't talk very much, even at all, today about the Espinoza decision regarding private schools and private religious schools, but we will discuss that on a future episode. But for now, thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching this on California Family Council's Facebook page and on YouTube. Please share it with your friends and family. You can obviously share it on Facebook. You can forward the link around on email. We appreciate your help. God bless, and we'll talk to you soon.